Your body right now, even if you ate a perfectly reasonable dinner last night, even if you slept 8 hours, even if you feel completely fine, is producing almost no growth hormone. Not because you are aging, because of when you last ate. And the mechanism behind that is more specific, more reversible, and more thoroughly documented than almost anything your doctor has mentioned in the last decade. By the time we get through every stage of what happens when you push your first meal to noon, you will understand why most people over 50 are running on the metabolic equivalent of a flooded engine. And I'm going to give you a 3-part protocol at the end of this called the noon reset that changes that without drugs, without meal plans, and without anything more complicated than a clock. The invisible villain in this story is not sugar, it is not carbohydrates, it is not processed food, though all of those things matter. The invisible villain is chronically elevated insulin, a hormone that is supposed to be a short-term delivery signal, but that most people in the developed world now keep active almost around the clock. Insulin does not hurt you when it does its job and leaves. It hurts you when it never fully drops. And the reason it never fully drops for most people is timing specifically the window between their last meal at night and their first meal the next morning, which has been shrinking for decades, while the food industry quietly expanded portion sizes, snack categories, and late-night eating culture. I find this genuinely fascinating, not because of some grand conspiracy, but because the incentive structure is so perfectly designed to keep you eating more often that you almost have to admire the engineering. The people selling you the food are not evil. They're just very, very good at their jobs. Here's what that means biologically. Insulin is released by your pancreas every time blood glucose rises, which happens every time you eat, including small snacks, including fruit, including what most people consider healthy eating between meals. Its job is to shuttle glucose into your cells and, critically, to signal your fat cells to stop releasing stored energy. Think of insulin as a factory manager who walks the floor and tells every storage worker to lock the warehouse doors. While the manager is on the floor, nothing comes out of storage. The moment the manager leaves, meaning insulin drops back to baseline, the warehouse doors open and your body can finally pull energy from fat. If the manager never fully leaves, because you are eating every 2 to 3 hours from 7 in the morning to 10 at night, those warehouse doors are locked for 16 or 17 hours a day. You are burning only what just came in. You are never touching what is stored. That is the trap. And the way out of it is time, not willpower. Now let me walk you through exactly what happens inside your body hour by hour when you eat your last meal in the evening and do not eat again until noon the next day. This is a 16-hour fast. It is the version of intermittent fasting most commonly studied under what researchers call time-restricted eating, which is the clinical term for confining your meals to a defined window. The leading research on this protocol comes out of the Salk Institute in San Diego, where a circadian biologist named Sachin Panda has been studying the relationship between meal timing and metabolic health for over a decade. His work, along with a landmark 2019 review published in the New England Journal of Medicine by neuroscientist Mark Mattson, forms the backbone of what I am about to explain. These are not fringe researchers. These are people publishing in the most credible medical journals on the planet, stage 1. Call this the delivery rush. This is the first 2 to 3 hours after your last meal of the day. Your digestive system is breaking food into glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids. Blood glucose rises, insulin spikes in response. Depending on what you ate and how much this insulin spike can be substantial, a large carbohydrate-heavy dinner can drive insulin levels to 10 or 20 times their fasting baseline. Your liver is receiving glucose signals and beginning to convert excess glucose into glycogen, which is basically glucose packed into a compact storage format, like compressing a file. The liver can hold roughly 100 grams of glycogen. Your muscles can hold another 300 to 500 grams, depending on their size and your training history. You are filling those tanks. You feel satisfied, maybe a little sleepy. That is a combination of serotonin precursors from tryptophan-containing foods and a shift in blood flow toward your gut. Your brain is not in danger. Your body knows exactly what to do with this. What most people do not realize is that during this phase, growth hormone secretion is actively suppressed. Human growth hormone, which builds and repairs muscle tissue, drives fat metabolism, and supports bone density is released in pulses, primarily during deep sleep. But insulin is one of its primary suppressors. When insulin is high, growth hormone cannot pulse effectively. If you are eating dinner at 8 or 9 in the evening and taking 2 or 3 hours to fully clear that insulin spike, you are cutting into the first portion of your nighttime growth hormone window. Over time, over years, this adds up to measurably less muscle repair, less fat mobilization overnight, and a slower metabolism, not dramatically slower night by night. But compounded across a decade, the difference is significant. Stage 2, call this the night shift begins. This is hours 3 through 7 after your last meal, roughly 11 at night to 2 or 3 in the morning for most people. Insulin is falling, not to zero, but toward baseline. Your liver is now in maintenance mode, slowly releasing glucose from its glycogen stores to keep your blood sugar stable while you sleep. The rate of this release is calibrated by glucagon, which is insulin's opposing hormone. It signals the liver to open the glycogen tanks and let glucose trickle out. You are now running on what you stored earlier in the evening. This is the biological equivalent of a restaurant switching from its kitchen to its freezer after close. The fresh deliveries are done. Now you are working through inventory. Here is something that surprises most people. Your brain consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy, despite being only about 2% of your body weight. And your brain is almost exclusively running on glucose during this stage. The neurons firing while you dream, the hippocampus consolidating your memories from the day, the prefrontal cortex sorting emotional experience, all of that requires a continuous glucose supply. Your liver is quietly providing it all night long, without you doing anything. This is not a fragile system. It evolved over millions of years to handle exactly this scenario. The idea that you need breakfast the moment you wake up to protect your brain is not physiology. It is marketing. More on that in a moment. At around hour 5 or 6 of fasting, something else begins. Your insulin has dropped enough that fat cells are beginning to release stored fatty acids into your bloodstream. Not at full speed yet, but the warehouse manager has left the floor and the doors are cracking open. Hormone-sensitive lipase, an enzyme sitting inside your fat cells that physically breaks apart stored fat molecules, is waking up. It was suppressed by insulin. Now it is activating. The fatty acids it releases travel through the bloodstream to muscle tissue and other organs that can burn them directly for energy. This is lipolysis, the technical term for fat breakdown, and it is beginning to happen in your body around the time most people are in their deepest sleep cycle, completely unaware. Stage 3. Call this the warehouse empties. This is hours 7 through 12 after your last meal, roughly 3 to 7 in the morning. Your liver glycogen stores are depleting. The liver has been slowly releasing glucose all night. And depending on how much glycogen it packed in and how active you were during the day, it may be running significantly low by the time you hit the 6 to 8 hour mark. When liver glycogen drops, the liver shifts into a more active fat burning mode. It begins pulling fatty acids from your bloodstream and doing something remarkable with them. It partially breaks them down into molecules called ketone bodies, specifically beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. These molecules can cross the blood-brain barrier and be used by your neurons as a direct fuel source. Your brain, which just hours ago was exclusively running on glucose, is now beginning to accept a second fuel source. This is the metabolic switch. Satchin research, along with Mattson's review, describes this switch as one of the most important and underappreciated aspects of human physiology. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, this switch flipped regularly. People did not eat around the clock. Food was episodic. The metabolic switch between glucose burning and ketone burning was a normal, recurring event. In the modern food environment, many people go years without ever fully flipping it because they never go long enough without eating for liver glycogen to deplete enough to trigger ketone production. The body is carrying hardware it is no longer using. Here is the part that should alarm you slightly. Research suggests that people who never flip this metabolic switch lose the efficiency of the underlying machinery over time. Mitochondria, the structures inside your cells that actually burn fuel and produce energy, appear to become less flexible when they are exclusively running on glucose. A study from researchers at the National Institute on Aging found that metabolic switching, practiced regularly, was associated with improvements in insulin sensitivity, reductions in blood pressure, and measurable changes in inflammatory markers. The word flexibility in metabolism refers to exactly this: the ability to shift fuel sources smoothly. Most people over 50 have lost significant metabolic flexibility without knowing it. They feel it as energy crashes in the late morning, brain fog before lunch, and difficulty losing weight despite eating what feels like a reasonable diet. Stage 4. Call this the cleaning crew arrives. This is hours 12 through 14 after your last meal, roughly 8 to 10 in the morning for someone who ate at 8 the previous evening. This is where the biology gets genuinely strange and worth understanding. At around the 12-hour mark of fasting, a process called autophagy begins upregulating significantly. Autophagy is the body's cellular recycling and quality control system. The word comes from the Greek for self-eating, which is an accurate description. Your cells begin digesting their own damaged or dysfunctional components. Misfolded proteins, worn out mitochondria, cellular debris that would otherwise accumulate the autophagy pathway identifies this material, tags it, and breaks it down into raw components that can be reused. This is not destruction, this is renovation. Think of it as the maintenance team that only gets access to the building after everyone has left for the night. Yoshinori Ohsumi won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2016, specifically for his work on autophagy mechanisms. This is not a fringe idea. The basic machinery of cellular self-cleaning is so fundamental that the Nobel Committee considered it one of the most important biological discoveries of the decade. What is fascinating, and what the mainstream wellness conversation still largely misses, is the connection between fasting duration and autophagy activation. Autophagy is always running at a low baseline level, but it requires the inhibition of a specific cellular signaling pathway called mTOR, the mammalian target of rapamycin, to really accelerate. And mTOR is kept active by amino acids from protein, by glucose from carbohydrates, and by insulin. When you eat, mTOR stays on and autophagy stays suppressed. When you fast long enough that insulin drops, glucose drops, and circulating amino acids drop, mTOR finally quiets down and autophagy shifts into a higher gear. The 12 to 14-hour mark is where this shift becomes clinically meaningful. Research published in the journal Autophagy has documented measurable increases in autophagy markers in human blood at the 16-hour fasting mark. Studies in animal models show that prolonged suppression of autophagy, which is what constant eating produces, is associated with accelerated accumulation of damaged proteins and cellular dysfunction. In the brain, specifically, this accumulation has been linked to the plaques and tangles associated with neurodegenerative disease. I am not saying fasting prevents Alzheimer's. The human clinical evidence is not there yet to make that claim cleanly. What the evidence does show is that the mechanism connecting poor autophagy to neurological damage is real, reproducible, and actively studied by some of the most credible labs in the world. Now here is the mainstream betrayal moment I promised you. For decades, the dominant public health message in the United States and most of the Western world has been that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. You have heard this your entire life. It is printed on cereal boxes. It is cited by pediatricians. It was the foundation of school nutrition programs. Here is where it actually came from. In the early 1900s, John Harvey Kellogg, yes, the Kellogg of cornflakes, was a significant proponent of breakfast eating as a health intervention, partly for genuinely held health reasons and partly because he was selling breakfast products. The campaign to medicalize breakfast was subsequently amplified by food manufacturers throughout the 20th century. By the 1980s, the message had been so thoroughly absorbed by mainstream medicine that it became clinical received wisdom, even though the underlying evidence for metabolic superiority of breakfast was, at best, weak and context dependent. In 2019, a large systematic review published in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, one of the oldest and most respected medical journals in the world, analyzed 13 randomized controlled trials on breakfast consumption and found no consistent evidence that eating breakfast aids weight loss or metabolic health in adults. In fact, in some studies, people who skipped breakfast consumed fewer total calories across the day without compensating at other meals. The review's authors were clear. The claim that breakfast is metabolically essential is not supported by rigorous evidence. The studies that appear to support it were often funded by cereal companies, suffered from confounding variables, or measured the wrong outcomes. The breakfast narrative, as applied to metabolic health in adults, is an artifact of industry influence on nutritional science, not a conspiracy, an incentive, a very profitable one. Stage 5. Call this the deep work phase. This is hours 14 through 16 after your last meal, the final stretch from 10 in the morning until noon. Human growth hormone is now surging. This is the part most people find shocking. Research has documented that a 24-hour fast produces growth hormone increases of 1,300% in men compared to their fed baseline. That number has been cited across multiple papers and appears in studies published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. A 16-hour fast produces a smaller but still substantial spike. Estimates vary across studies, but growth hormone secretion during the later hours of an overnight fast is measurably and significantly elevated compared to a state of regular eating. Growth hormone in the context of fasting does two things that matter enormously for people over 50. First, it drives fat oxidation. It tells fat tissue to release stored energy. Second, it preserves lean muscle mass during the fast itself, which addresses the most common concern people raise about fasting. Won't I lose muscle? The answer, based on the research, is nuanced. Short-term fasting, meaning fasts of 16 to 24 hours, does not cause muscle breakdown in the way prolonged caloric restriction does. The combination of elevated growth hormone and the mild elevation of norepinephrine that occurs during fasting actually appears to preserve lean mass while preferentially targeting stored fat. A study published in Obesity Reviews found that alternate day fasting and time-restricted eating protocols preserved lean mass significantly better than continuous caloric restriction, producing the same total caloric deficit. The mechanism is the growth hormone surge. It is a built-in protection system that your body activates specifically because it needs your muscles to remain functional when food is unavailable. Evolution did not design you to waste your muscle when your next meal was simply delayed by a few hours. Also occurring in this final stretch, norepinephrine, the same neurotransmitter involved in alertness and focus, rises during fasting. Contrary to what most people expect, the late morning hours of a 16-hour fast are often accompanied by sharpened mental clarity rather than cognitive decline. This has a direct neurological explanation. Ketone bodies, particularly beta-hydroxybutyrate, are a more efficient fuel per unit of oxygen than glucose. Some neuroscientists describe them as a cleaner burning fuel, a characterization that is a simplification but carries functional accuracy. Studies on cognitive performance during mild ketosis, which can begin developing in the later hours of a 16-hour fast for someone with good metabolic flexibility, show improvements in working memory, sustained attention, and verbal processing in adults over 40. Separately, fasting in this stage drives meaningful increases in a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF is essentially a growth and repair signal for brain tissue. It promotes the survival of existing neurons and the formation of new neural connections. Low BDNF is associated with depression, cognitive decline, and reduced neuroplasticity. Mark Mattson's research at the National Institute on Aging specifically identified intermittent fasting as one of the most reliable dietary stimulators of BDNF in animal models and the human data, while less complete, is consistent with those findings. The mechanism involves the cellular stress response. Mild, repeated metabolic challenges like fasting activate the same protective pathways that physical exercise activates. The brain responds to the stress of fuel restriction by upregulating its own repair and resilience systems. This is the same logic as why exercise makes muscles stronger. The stimulus of stress, applied at the right dose, produces adaptation. Now let me address the cortisol question, because this is where a lot of the online debate about morning fasting goes sideways. Cortisol, often called the stress hormone, naturally peaks in the morning in what is called the cortisol awakening response. This peak typically occurs between 6 and 9 in the morning, and it rises to its daily maximum within 20 to 30 minutes of waking. People who are against morning fasting often argue that this cortisol peak plus an empty stomach is a recipe for muscle breakdown and metabolic stress. This is technically half correct and practically misleading. Cortisol in the morning does drive gluconeogenesis, the liver converting amino acids and glycerol into glucose to maintain blood sugar. But in a healthy person fasting overnight, this process is calibrated. The cortisol peak is there precisely to prepare you for activity, mobilize energy, and maintain alertness. It is not equivalent to the cortisol spikes produced by chronic psychological stress, which are genuinely damaging. The morning cortisol peak during a normal 16-hour fast does not meaningfully erode lean mass in the research literature. What does erode lean mass is multi-day fasting without adequate protein intake across the feeding window. The morning cortisol argument against time-restricted eating conflates a normal diurnal hormone rhythm with a pathological stress response. They are categorically different things. There's also an important gut-level story happening across this entire 16-hour window that almost never gets discussed. Your gut has its own nervous system, a network of over 100 million neurons lining your gastrointestinal tract, sometimes called the enteric nervous system, or more colloquially, the second brain. This system requires a rest period. Active digestion is metabolically expensive, and the gut lining itself undergoes regular repair and renewal, a process partly coordinated by the migrating motor complex, a wave of electrical activity that sweeps through your small intestine roughly every 90 minutes during fasting. This wave is often called the intestinal housekeeper because it sweeps debris, bacteria, and undigested material through the gut. The migrating motor complex is suppressed every time you eat. It only activates in a fasted state. People who graze continuously throughout the day essentially never let their intestinal housekeeper finish its rounds. Over time, this has been associated with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, a condition where bacteria that belong in the large intestine migrate upward into the small intestine, causing bloating, gas, and disrupted nutrient absorption. A 16-hour fast gives the migrating motor complex several complete cycles per night to do its work. Let me now talk about what happens at the hormonal level for people, specifically over 50, because this is where the fasting until noon protocol becomes particularly relevant and where the mainstream conversation is almost completely silent. Insulin sensitivity, meaning how effectively your cells respond to insulin signals, naturally declines with age. This decline is not dramatic in healthy people, but it is measurable, and it is accelerated by the combination of reduced physical activity, changing muscle mass, and years of high-frequency eating patterns. By 50, many people are experiencing subclinical insulin resistance, which means their cells are responding slightly less efficiently to insulin, so the pancreas secretes slightly more insulin to compensate, which keeps insulin levels slightly more elevated, which further reduces fat oxidation, which contributes to gradual weight gain, which further worsens insulin sensitivity. This is a slow motion spiral. It does not feel like a disease. It feels like getting older. The two have become so conflated in our culture that most people accept the weight gain, the energy crashes, and the growing midsection as inevitable features of aging rather than as symptoms of a metabolic state they could partially address. Caloric restriction research has existed for decades, but the specific effect of eating window compression, distinct from total calorie reduction, has only become a serious research focus in the last 10 to 15 years. Sachin Panda's lab published research in 2019 in the journal Cell Metabolism, showing that overweight adults who compressed their eating to a 10-hour window without being told to reduce calories spontaneously consumed fewer calories and showed improvements in fasting, insulin, blood pressure, and cholesterol levels after 12 weeks. A related study from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, published in Obesity, found that men with prediabetes who ate all their meals within a 6-hour window, even without caloric restriction, showed dramatically improved insulin sensitivity after 5 weeks, with fasting insulin dropping by 3 times as much as the control group. The mechanism is not simply fewer calories, The mechanism is the combination of lower average insulin levels across the day, extended fat oxidation windows, and improved circadian alignment of metabolic processes. That word circadian matters here. Every organ in your body runs on a roughly 24-hour biological clock, synchronized to light-dark cycles. Your liver's metabolic efficiency peaks in the morning and early afternoon. Your insulin sensitivity is highest in the morning and declines through the evening. Your pancreas secretes insulin more efficiently at noon than it does at 10 at night. Eating a large meal at 9 or 10 in the evening asks your metabolic system to handle a delivery at the worst possible time when the warehouse crew is clocked out and the night shift is not equipped for a full load. Research from the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel found that the same meal eaten at 9 in the morning produced a significantly lower blood glucose spike than the same meal eaten at 9 in the evening in the same person on the same day. This is not a small effect. Glucose responses to identical meals varied by up to 50% depending on the time of eating. Your body is not the same machine at night as it is in the morning. Treating those two states as equivalent is one of the more expensive metabolic mistakes the modern food environment has normalized. For me personally, and I mention this carefully because my situation is not a template the same, shift to time-restricted eating was one of the first structural changes I made after my cardiac event 5 years ago. Not because some influencer told me to, because my wife, who became genuinely obsessive about the research in a way that I am now grateful for, found Panda's work before it was mainstream and walked me through the mechanism. I was still on a stack of medications. I was not replacing any of it with fasting. I was adding a timing structure to what I was already doing under medical supervision. I want to be clear about that distinction because I am not here to tell you that fasting reverses heart disease. I do not know that. What the research tells me and what I experience is that the metabolic environment you create through eating windows affects the downstream conditions that contribute to cardiovascular risk. Insulin levels, inflammation, blood lipid patterns, body composition. The mechanism is real. The results vary dramatically depending on the person. Work with your doctor, but do not expect your doctor to spontaneously bring this up because most medical training includes almost no coursework on nutrition, timing, and the incentive structure of a 15-minute office visit is not designed to produce lifestyle conversations. By the time you reach noon on a 16-hour fast, here is the cumulative metabolic state your body has achieved. Insulin is at its lowest point of the day. Glucagon has been active for hours. Fatty acids are circulating freely. Your liver is producing ketone bodies. Growth hormone has surged. Autophagy is running at an accelerated rate. Your gut's cleaning wave has completed several cycles. BDNF is elevated. Norepinephrine is supporting mental clarity. Your mitochondria have been asked to use both glucose and fat, the exercise that keeps them flexible. This is not a starvation state. This is the state your body evolved to enter regularly and spent the last century being systematically prevented from reaching by a food environment designed for continuous consumption. When you finally eat at noon, your metabolic machinery is primed for it. Insulin sensitivity is higher than it would be if you had eaten breakfast 2 hours ago. Nutrient partitioning, meaning how effectively your cells use the protein, carbohydrates, and fat you consume, is improved. Research from Panda's lab shows that when people eat their first meal after a 16-hour fast, the downstream glucose response is blunted compared to eating the same meal after a shorter fast. The body absorbs nutrients more efficiently and stores less of the excess. That efficiency compounds over time, across weeks and months. There are legitimate counterpoints worth addressing because I am not interested in selling you a protocol that has no trade-offs. First, fasting is not appropriate for everyone. People with a history of eating disorders should not practice time restriction without clinical guidance. Pregnant or breastfeeding individuals should not restrict eating windows. People on certain diabetes medications, particularly sulfonylureas or insulin, face genuine hypoglycemia risk during extended fasts and need medical supervision before changing eating schedules. People who are already underweight should not practice caloric restriction in any form without medical oversight. These are not disclaimers for legal protection. These are real clinical categories where fasting until noon could cause harm. Second, There is a meaningful question about whether the benefits of time-restricted eating are primarily a function of eating less total food, a caloric reduction explanation, rather than something specific to the fasting state itself. This debate is active in the research literature. The most honest answer is probably both. The hormonal environment of a genuine fasted state appears to produce benefits beyond what is explained by caloric reduction alone, particularly with respect to growth hormone, autophagy, and gut motility. But people who practice time-restricted eating do, on average, eat somewhat fewer calories than they would with unrestricted access. Both mechanisms likely contribute, and separating them perfectly is difficult in human research. The practical implication is that the eating window you compress still needs to contain adequate nutrition, adequate protein in particular. A 16-hour fast followed by 6 hours of poor food choices does not produce the benefits you are hoping for. The fasting window is not a permission structure for the eating window. Now, here's the noon reset. This is the protocol I have been building toward, and I named it not just for the time, but because it stands for 3 components: narrow, optimize, and offset. These are the 3 levers that determine whether a 16-hour fast actually produces the metabolic outcomes described above, or whether it becomes an exercise in skipping breakfast with no meaningful benefit. Narrow is the first component. This means compressing your eating window to 8 hours or fewer, beginning no earlier than noon. The specific target is a 16-hour fasting window as a minimum. In practice, this means your first meal is at noon and your last meal is no later than 8 in the evening. The research supports this window as the threshold at which meaningful metabolic switching and autophagy upregulation occur consistently. Shorter windows, 10 hours or 12 hours, produce some benefits, but appear to fall below the threshold for consistent autophagy activation and significant growth hormone response in most adults. The specific mistake people make here is starting their fast from when they stop eating at night, rather than from when they fall asleep, and then feeling justified eating at 9 in the morning because technically it has been 12 hours. That 12 hours is not the same as 16. The biology is not running on a technicality. Optimize is the second component. This addresses the quality and composition of what you eat within your 8-hour window, with one specific number: your protein target. Research on muscle protein synthesis and aging, particularly work from the lab of Stuart Phillips at McMaster University, consistently identifies protein intake as the single most important dietary variable for preserving lean mass in people over 50. The recommendation that emerges from this research is a minimum of 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, distributed across your eating window rather than consumed in a single meal. For an 80-kilogram person, that is approximately 96 grams of protein distributed across noon and the evening meal. This is roughly double what most older adults actually consume, according to survey data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Fasting until noon without hitting this protein target produces a state where you have all the hormonal signals for muscle preservation, but none of the raw material to act on them. Offset is the third component. This means deliberately introducing a brief movement stimulus in the late fasting window, specifically in the hour before breaking your fast. This can be a 20-minute walk, a brief body weight session, or any activity that elevates your heart rate modestly. The mechanism is precise. Exercise in the fasted state increases the translocation of GLUT, 4 transporters glucose entry channels, to the surface of muscle cells. When you subsequently eat, your muscles are significantly more receptive to glucose uptake. A study published in the Journal of Applied Physiology found that a brief bout of exercise in the fasted state improved glucose uptake in the subsequent meal by approximately 30% compared to the same meal eaten without prior exercise. This is the metabolic primer. It does not have to be intense. It has to happen. The common mistake that invalidates the entire noon reset is treating the offset as optional, skipping the movement on busy mornings and going straight from fast to meal. Without the movement stimulus, you are missing the final priming step that makes the insulin sensitivity gains from fasting maximally actionable. 3 components: a specific window, a specific protein number, a specific movement stimulus. That is the noon reset. And everything I described in the 50+ stages leading to this point is why each component exists. Not because someone invented a protocol and worked backward to justify it. Because the biology of what happens in a fasted body, stage by stage, from 8 at night to noon the next day, points toward exactly these 3 interventions as the logical response. One last thing before you close this. The most common question I get about fasting until noon is about hunger specifically, the assumption that the late morning hours will be miserable. And in week 1, for most people, they are uncomfortable. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, is partly habit trained. It spikes at the times you have historically eaten. If you have eaten breakfast at 8 every morning for 20 years, your ghrelin will spike at 8. The spike is real. The discomfort is real. But ghrelin is one of the most adaptation-responsive hormones in your body. Research shows that ghrelin patterns shift significantly within 1 to 2 weeks of a consistent new eating schedule. The morning hunger that feels unbearable in day 3 is genuinely reduced by day 10 for most people. This is not motivation talk. This is receptor downregulation and hormonal reentrainment, documented in studies on meal timing and appetite adaptation. The discomfort is temporary. The metabolic shift is not. If you are going to start the noon reset this week, comment noon below so I can see who is actually doing this. And if you want to understand the second half of this equation, what to eat and when within those 8 hours, to maximize everything I described today, subscribe, because that video goes deeper into the protein timing and the specific foods that either accelerate or block the autophagy window.